$5. The auctioneer shouted as an old military footlocker covered in dust rolled onto the stage. Nobody wanted it. People laughed, shook their heads, and looked away. Then an 84-year-old veteran named Walter Hayes quietly raised his hand. $5. The room chuckled. The young auction manager, Tyler Brooks, smirked. Congratulations, sir. You just bought a box full of mold. More laughter echoed through the hall. Walter didn't react. He slowly walked forward, placed a weathered hand on the lid, and froze. There, barely visible beneath decades of scratches, were two faded letters carved into the metal, R6. Something changed in his eyes. Tyler noticed. Come on, old-timer, he called out. Open it. Let's see what treasure $5 buys these days. Phones came out. People gathered closer. Walter hesitated for a moment before lifting the rusted latch. The hinges groaned. The room expected junk. Instead, inside lay a faded field jacket, a burned compass, a black patch shaped like a raven, and a photograph of 6 young soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder. A sudden silence spread across the crowd. Walter picked up the photograph. His hands trembled. 50 years vanished. Rain, rotor blades, mud, fear. 6 men abandoned deep behind enemy lines. And one promise never forgotten. Then a woman near the back stepped forward. Emily Carter, military historian. Her face went pale the moment she saw the raven patch. Where did you get this? She whispered. Walter didn't answer. Emily carefully turned over the photograph and stopped breathing. Written on the back was a name she had only seen once before in a classified archive. Raven 6. Her hands shook as she grabbed her phone. That can't be possible. Minutes later, while the crowd stood confused, a convoy of black SUVs pulled into the parking lot. Heads turned. Doors opened. A retired 4-star general stepped out and walked directly into the auction hall. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The general stopped in front of Walter Hayes, looked at the footlocker, looked at the old man, and slowly raised his hand in salute. The entire room froze. Tyler's smile disappeared. Emily stared in disbelief. And then the general said 5 words that changed everything. We thought you were dead. You ever see a room go silent over $5? The auctioneer's voice echoed across the old county fair building as rain tapped softly against the metal roof overhead. Rows of folding chairs stretched beneath fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly in the damp afternoon air. Most people were there looking for bargains, antiques, or something they could flip for a profit. Nobody had come for the battered military footlocker sitting alone near the back of the stage. Its olive drab paint had faded decades ago. Rust crept along the corners. One hinge looked barely attached. A white auction tag hung from the handle. Lot 47. Starting bid, $5. The auctioneer pointed toward it with little enthusiasm. All right, folks, who wants this old thing? Nobody moved. A few people glanced at it before returning to their phones. Someone near the front chuckled. Looks like it belongs in a landfill. More laughter followed. The auctioneer shrugged. $5 then. Anybody? That was when a hand slowly rose from the third row. Walter Hayes sat quietly among the crowd, his weathered denim jacket zipped halfway against the chill. At 84 years old, he looked like a man who preferred being unnoticed. His white hair peeked from beneath a faded ball cap. His hands rested calmly on a worn wooden cane. $5, he said. The room turned toward him. A grin spread across the face of Tyler Brooks, the young auction manager standing near the stage. At 29, Tyler carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never been told he was wrong. Well, he announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. Looks like somebody found treasure. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. Walter didn't react. The auctioneer brought down the gavel. Sold. Tyler walked over and grabbed the handle of the footlocker. Congratulations, sir. $5 for 40 pounds of dust and disappointment. More laughter. Walter rose slowly from his chair and made his way toward the stage. His boots clicked softly against the concrete floor. Tyler placed the footlocker in front of him with exaggerated care. Want us to help carry your fortune out to the truck? Walter ignored the comment. Instead, he stared at the top of the footlocker. For several seconds, he said nothing. The laughter gradually faded. Something had caught his attention. Beneath layers of scratches, dirt, and faded paint, 2 barely visible characters had been carved into the metal decades earlier. R6. Walter's expression changed almost imperceptibly. His shoulders stiffened. His pale blue eyes narrowed. Suddenly, he wasn't looking at an old storage box anymore. Tyler noticed. "What is it?" he asked with a smirk. "You think there's gold inside?" The crowd leaned forward. Walter slowly reached out and brushed dust from the lid with trembling fingers. The room seemed quieter now. Even the rain outside felt distant. Then, for the first time since entering the building, Walter Hayes spoke more than a few words. "I never thought I'd see this again." The words settled over the room like a sudden drop in temperature. Nobody laughed this time. Tyler folded his arms, still wearing a confident smile, but even he seemed uncertain now. Walter kept his eyes fixed on the faded carving. His thumb moved slowly across the letters as though tracing the outline of a memory. The auction hall faded around him. The hum of fluorescent lights, the rustle of jackets, the steady rain against the roof. For a brief moment, none of it seemed to exist. He was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere far away and long ago. Tyler cleared his throat. "You know this box?" Walter blinked once before looking up. "I knew the man who owned it." The answer was simple, but something about the way he said it caused several people nearby to exchange glances. Tyler laughed awkwardly. "That is one heck of a coincidence." Walter did not answer. He slowly knelt beside the footlocker. Every movement was careful, deliberate. The metal latch resisted at first. Decades of dust and corrosion held it shut. Then came a sharp click. The sound echoed far louder than it should have. Several people leaned forward in their seats. Phones appeared. Cameras started recording. Tyler stepped closer, eager to turn the moment back into entertainment. "Go ahead," he said. "Let us see what $5 buys." Walter lifted the lid. A faint scent of old canvas and aged paper drifted into the air. The contents were arranged exactly as they had been left years before. A folded field jacket rested on top. Beneath it sat a weathered compass, a small notebook wrapped in cloth, and a black patch marked with the outline of a raven. Nobody spoke. Walter carefully picked up the jacket. His hands trembled slightly. Sewn above one pocket was a faded name tape. J. Mallory. The room remained silent. Walter stared at the stitching for several seconds. His eyes softened. Across the hall, a woman standing near a display of antique tools suddenly froze. Emily Carter had attended the auction hoping to find historical artifacts for a local museum project. The moment she saw the raven patch, something felt wrong. Not dangerous. Familiar. She stepped forward, her attention locked on the symbol. The patch was worn nearly smooth, but she recognized it instantly. She had seen it once before inside a military archive photograph that had never been displayed publicly. Her heartbeat quickened. "Excuse me," she said quietly. Walter looked toward her. Emily pointed at the patch. "May I see that?" Walter hesitated before handing it over. Emily examined the stitching. The room watched in confusion as the color slowly drained from her face. Tyler noticed. "What is it?" Emily did not answer immediately. She turned the patch over. Hidden beneath years of wear was a faded marking written in black ink. 3 characters. R6. Emily looked from the patch to Walter, then back to the patch again. "That is impossible," she whispered. And for the first time all afternoon, Walter Hayes looked genuinely concerned. Tyler let out a nervous laugh. "Impossible? It is a patch, not a winning lottery ticket." A few people chuckled with him, but the sound died quickly. Emily Carter was no longer paying attention to anyone else in the room. Her eyes remained fixed on the faded raven emblem resting in her hands. She traced the worn stitching carefully, as if afraid the patch might disappear if she touched it too hard. Walter watched her quietly. The old veteran's face revealed almost nothing, yet there was a heaviness behind his eyes now, a weight that seemed older than the room itself. Outside, rain continued tapping against the metal roof in a steady rhythm. Inside, nobody seemed interested in the auction anymore. "Tell me where you got this," Emily said. Walter glanced at the open footlocker. "I bought it 30 minutes ago." "No," Emily replied softly. "I mean before today. Have you seen that symbol before?" Walter looked down at the photograph lying beside the jacket. 6 young men stood shoulder to shoulder beneath a bright sky. Their uniforms were dusty. Their expressions were calm. One of them smiled directly at the camera. Walter reached for the picture and gently brushed his thumb across the image. "A very long time ago." Emily swallowed. "Do you know what R6 means?" Tyler rolled his eyes. "Here we go." Emily ignored him. "I spent 3 years cataloging military archives. Most records are public. Some are restricted. A few are almost impossible to access. She looked at Walter again. I saw this symbol once. One photograph. One page. That was it. The room listened. Even the auctioneer remained silent. Emily continued. The file disappeared the next day. Tyler folded his arms. So what are you saying? Secret soldiers? Hidden missions? Emily did not answer immediately. Instead, she carefully unfolded the field jacket. Something slid from an inside pocket and landed softly on the table. A sealed envelope. Every eye followed it. The paper had yellowed with age. Dust lifted into the air as Emily picked it up. Written across the front in faded blue ink were 4 words. If found, deliver home. Walter's breath caught almost imperceptibly. He recognized the handwriting instantly. James Mallory. For a moment, the auction hall seemed to vanish. He could almost hear an old voice laughing somewhere beyond the years. Tyler stepped closer. His confidence had begun to crack beneath curiosity. Open it. Walter stared at the envelope. Decades had passed since he last saw that handwriting. Decades since he believed every trace of those days had been lost forever. Emily carefully turned the envelope over. The seal remained intact, untouched, unopened, for more than 50 years. Walter, she whispered, I think this was meant for someone. Walter nodded slowly. It was. Who? Emily asked. Walter looked at the name written in the corner, and for the first time a shadow crossed his calm expression. The answer came almost as a whisper. Me. The silence that followed seemed to stretch across the entire building. Nobody moved. Nobody laughed. Even Tyler Brooks, who had spent the last hour turning everything into a joke, stood frozen beside the table. Emily looked down at the envelope and then back at Walter. This was addressed to you? Walter nodded slowly. The overhead lights reflected faintly in his pale blue eyes. James always had terrible handwriting, he said quietly. A few people smiled nervously, unsure whether it was appropriate. Walter did not. His gaze remained fixed on the envelope. More than half a century had passed since he had last seen his friend's name written on paper. The years suddenly felt very short. Emily carefully handed him the envelope. Walter accepted it with both hands. The paper felt fragile. Time had turned it delicate. Around him, dozens of strangers watched in complete silence. The rain continued outside. The steady tapping against the roof sounded almost like a distant clock counting backward through decades. Walter traced the faded ink with his thumb. For a moment, he seemed unsure whether to open it. Then he slowly broke the seal. The crackle of old paper echoed across the room. Inside was a folded letter and something else. A small black and white photograph slid onto the table. Emily picked it up carefully. It showed the same 6 young men from the earlier picture, but this one was different. They were sitting together beside a tent beneath a bright sky. Smiling. Relaxed. Ordinary. The kind of photograph people take when they assume there will always be another tomorrow. Walter stared at it for several seconds before unfolding the letter. His hands trembled slightly. Not from age. From memory. He began reading silently. The room waited. Emily could see emotions crossing his face one after another. Surprise. Sadness. Warmth. Then something else. Confusion. Tyler noticed it too. What does it say? He asked. Walter did not answer immediately. Instead, he continued reading. Near the bottom of the page, his eyes suddenly stopped. The old veteran straightened in his chair. A muscle tightened in his jaw. Emily felt a knot form in her stomach. Walter. Slowly, he lowered the letter. That does not make sense. The words came out almost as a whisper. What? Emily asked. Walter turned the page toward her. Most of the letter contained ordinary memories. Names. Places. Private jokes between old friends. But one sentence near the bottom had been underlined twice. Emily read it and felt her pulse quicken. If you are reading this, do not trust the official story. Tyler frowned. Official story about what? Walter's eyes drifted back toward the open footlocker. For the first time since the box had been opened, he looked genuinely unsettled. Then he reached inside and began searching beneath the remaining contents. Canvas shifted. Old papers rustled. Finally, his hand stopped. Hidden beneath the false bottom of the footlocker was a narrow metal compartment that none of them had noticed before. Emily stared. Tyler took a step forward. Walter slowly lifted the concealed panel. And what lay beneath it made all 3 of them forget how to breathe for a moment. Inside the hidden compartment rested a leather-bound notebook no larger than a paperback novel. The dark brown cover was cracked with age. Water stains marked the corners. A faded elastic band still held it closed after all these years. Nobody spoke. Walter stared at it, as though he were looking at a ghost. Emily leaned closer. Tyler abandoned every trace of sarcasm. The notebook felt important even before anyone touched it. Walter slowly lifted it from the compartment. Dust drifted into the air. The old leather creaked softly beneath his fingers. For several seconds, he simply held it. Then he exhaled. James kept notes, he said quietly. About everything. Emily's eyes widened. A field journal? Walter nodded. Something like that. The room seemed smaller now. The crowd that had gathered around the table stood shoulder to shoulder, completely captivated. Outside, rain continued to fall, but nobody noticed anymore. Walter removed the elastic band and carefully opened the cover. On the first page, written in neat blue ink, was a date from more than 50 years earlier. Beneath it sat a title, Raven 6. A chill moved through Emily. She recognized the name immediately. It was the same designation she had seen buried inside a forgotten archive years ago. Tyler looked confused. What exactly is Raven 6? Walter remained silent. His eyes scanned the page. Memories seemed to flicker behind them like distant lights. He turned another page, then another. Hand-drawn maps, coordinates, names, weather notes, equipment lists, ordinary details recorded with extraordinary care. James Mallory had documented everything. Emily watched Walter's expression change as he read. The notebook was not just a journal. It was a doorway, a bridge back to a part of his life he had spent decades trying not to revisit. Then something slipped free from between two pages. A folded sheet of paper landed on the table. Unlike the letter, this page looked official. Its paper stock was heavier. A government seal sat at the top. Emily carefully unfolded it. Her eyes moved across the text. Then she stopped. Walter. He looked up. You need to see this. She turned the document toward him. Across the top, stamped in large red letters, were two words. Declassified copy. Tyler stared. Wait. This is government paperwork. Emily nodded slowly. Walter accepted the page and began reading. The room watched every movement. Halfway down the document, his hand froze. His breathing slowed. The old veteran read the same sentence twice. Then a third time. No, he whispered. That is not possible. Emily felt tension tighten in her chest. What is it? Walter looked up. The color had drained from his face. According to this report, he said quietly, James was never supposed to have this notebook. Tyler frowned. Why? Walter lowered the page. The answer came slowly, carefully, as though saying it out loud might somehow make it more real. Because someone spent decades trying to make sure nobody ever saw what was written inside. The words settled over the crowd with unsettling weight. Nobody knew exactly what they meant, but everyone understood they mattered. Tyler glanced around the room, as if expecting someone to explain what was happening. Nobody did. Walter lowered the document onto the table and looked back at the notebook. The old leather cover seemed heavier now. More important, Emily pulled out her phone. Her fingers moved quickly across the screen. She searched names, archive references, military history databases, anything connected to Raven 6. The results were almost non-existent. That alone made her uneasy. In her experience, even obscure military units left traces. Mentions, photographs, citations, something. But Raven 6 seemed to exist only in fragments. A patch, a photograph, a hidden notebook, and now a declassified report that should not have been there. Walter, Emily said quietly, how many people knew about this designation? Walter stared at the photograph of the 6 young men. 6. Tyler blinked. Just 6. Walter nodded. At least that was the idea. The answer raised more questions than it solved. Emily returned her attention to the notebook. Near the back, she noticed several pages folded together. Unlike the earlier entries, these pages carried different markings. James Mallory had circled names, dates, locations. Some lines had been crossed out entirely. Others had notes written beside them in red ink. Walter leaned closer. His eyes moved across the pages. Then they stopped. I remember this. Emily looked up. What is it? Walter tapped a location on one page. This town. His voice grew distant. We passed through here before everything changed. The rain outside intensified. Wind rattled the building's metal siding. The atmosphere inside the auction hall felt strangely suspended, as though time itself had slowed down. Tyler read over Walter's shoulder. There is another name here. Emily followed his finger. One name appeared repeatedly throughout the final pages. Not a military designation. Not a code. A person. General Robert Whitaker. Emily frowned. That cannot be the same Whitaker. Walter looked at her. Why not? Because if it is, Emily said carefully, he is still alive. Silence followed. Most people in the room recognized the name immediately. Robert Whitaker was one of the most respected retired generals in the country. His interviews appeared on national television. His speeches filled auditoriums. His reputation was legendary. Tyler laughed nervously. You are telling me a retired four-star general is connected to a $5 Footlocker sitting in a county auction? Nobody laughed with him. Emily continued reading. Then her eyes widened. Near the bottom of the final page, James had written a single instruction and underlined it 3 times. If this notebook is ever found, call Whitaker immediately. Emily looked up slowly. Walter's expression had become unreadable. Tyler stared at the page. The crowd stood completely still. Then Emily reached for her phone again. I think, she said softly, there is only one way to find out if any of this is real. Emily stepped away from the table and moved toward the far corner of the auction hall where the signal was strongest. Every eye followed her. The notebook remained open beneath the fluorescent lights. The raven patch rested beside the photograph. The old Footlocker sat in the center of it all like a forgotten vault that had suddenly decided to reveal its secrets. Walter remained seated, his hands folded around his cane. He looked calm, but inside, memories long buried had begun to stir. Across the room, Tyler paced nervously. You cannot seriously be calling a retired 4-star general, he said. Emily did not respond. She was focused on her phone. She searched through public directories, foundation websites, and veteran organizations. To her surprise, she found a direct office number connected to General Robert Whitaker's charitable foundation. Her finger hovered over the screen. The room felt impossibly quiet. Then she pressed call. The line rang once, twice, 3 times. Finally, a professional voice answered. Emily introduced herself and briefly explained what had been found. At first, the assistant sounded polite but skeptical. Then Emily mentioned the notebook, the raven patch, and finally the words Raven 6. Silence. Complete silence. The assistant did not speak for several seconds. Emily felt a chill run through her. Hello, she asked. The voice returned, but the tone had changed completely. Please hold. The line clicked. Emily looked back toward Walter. He had not moved. Rain continued tapping against the roof overhead. Somewhere near the front of the building, an old clock ticked steadily. Every second seemed louder than the last. Nearly a minute passed. Then a different voice came onto the line. Older, calm, controlled. This is Whitaker. Emily froze. Tyler froze. Even though nobody else could hear the conversation, they instantly knew something had changed. Emily swallowed. General Whitaker? Yes. The answer was immediate. Who is this? Emily explained everything again. The auction, the Footlocker, the notebook, the photograph, the letter. She carefully described the hidden compartment and the pages bearing his name. The general did not interrupt once. When she finished, there was silence again. Then one question came through the speaker. Quiet. Precise. Who currently has the notebook? Emily looked across the room. Walter was watching her. A man named Walter Hayes. The response was so fast it almost sounded involuntary. Walter Hayes is there. Emily's pulse quickened. Yes, sir. Another pause followed. This one felt different. Heavier. When Whitaker spoke again, his voice carried something she had not expected. Emotion. Stay where you are, he said. Do not leave that building. Emily glanced around the crowded auction hall. Sir, I am coming. The call ended. Emily slowly lowered the phone. Tyler stared at her. Well, she looked from Tyler to Walter. Then she delivered the words that caused an uneasy ripple to spread through the crowd. He did not ask for proof. He did not ask for photographs. He only asked one thing. Walter's eyes narrowed slightly. Emily took a breath. He asked if Walter Hayes was still there. The next 40 minutes felt longer than the previous 50 years. Nobody left the auction hall. Nobody even talked much anymore. The Footlocker remained open beneath the fluorescent lights. The notebook rested beside the raven patch. The photograph of 6 young men sat in the center of the table like a forgotten piece of history that had suddenly become important again. Walter Hayes remained seated quietly, his weathered hands folded over the top of his cane. He had spent most of his life avoiding attention. Now an entire room watched him. Tyler stood near the stage, checking the entrance every few minutes. His earlier confidence had vanished completely. Emily remained beside the table, reviewing the notebook again and again, searching for details she might have missed. Outside, the rain finally began to ease. The steady drumming on the roof softened to a light patter. Then headlights appeared through the front windows. Several people turned. A black SUV rolled slowly into the parking lot. Then another, and another. The conversation inside the building died instantly. Doors opened outside. Dark suits. Purposeful movements. People who clearly were not there for an auction. Tyler felt his stomach tighten. Emily exchanged a glance with Walter. The old veteran's expression did not change. The front door opened. Cool air drifted inside. Every head turned toward the entrance. An older man stepped through the doorway. Tall, silver-haired, straight-backed despite his age. There was no mistaking him. Even people who had only seen him on television recognized him immediately. General Robert Whitaker had arrived. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The retired four-star general paused just inside the entrance and surveyed the room. His eyes passed over the crowd, over the auction tables, over the open Footlocker. Then they stopped on Walter Hayes. For a moment, neither man said a word. 50 years seemed to disappear between them. Emily watched something remarkable happen. The general's posture changed. The confident public figure vanished. In his place stood a man looking at someone he had not expected to see again. Whitaker began walking forward. His footsteps echoed softly across the concrete floor. The crowd parted without being asked. Tyler stepped aside. Emily stepped aside. Everyone did. The general stopped directly in front of Walter. The room was so quiet that people could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights. Walter slowly rose to his feet. The two old men looked at each other for several long seconds. Then General Whitaker did something nobody expected. He stood perfectly straight and raised his hand in a formal salute. Gasps spread through the room. Tyler felt his knees weaken. Emily simply stared. Walter looked almost embarrassed by the gesture. But Whitaker held the salute. His voice was calm when he finally spoke. "Walter Hayes," he said, "after all these years, it is an honor to see you again." The salute remained in the air for several long seconds. Nobody in the auction hall knew what to do with what they had just witnessed. A retired four-star general had entered a small county auction and saluted an 84-year-old man who had purchased an old Footlocker for $5. Tyler Brooks stood motionless near the stage. The memory of his jokes felt painfully distant now. Emily Carter watched Walter and General Whitaker with quiet disbelief. The general finally lowered his hand. His eyes drifted to the photograph on the table, then to the raven patch, then to the notebook. He nodded slowly. "I wondered if this day would ever come," he said. Walter looked at him carefully. "James kept it all this time." Whitaker exhaled. "Apparently he did." The general reached toward the photograph and gently touched the corner. 6 young faces stared back from another lifetime. "We were never supposed to become a story," he said softly. "We were just supposed to come home." The room remained silent. No one wanted to interrupt. Whitaker looked toward the crowd. "Most people will never recognize those names," he continued. "But some of the finest men I have ever known are standing in this photograph." His eyes returned to Walter. "And the finest of them all is still here." Walter shook his head slightly. "You always exaggerated." For the first time, Whitaker smiled. "Not then. Not now." A few quiet laughs moved through the room. The tension finally eased. Emily looked at the notebook. "What happens to all of this?" she asked. Whitaker considered the question. "That depends on Walter." Every eye turned toward the old veteran. Walter stared at the Footlocker, the rusted corners, the faded paint, the hidden compartment, the notebook, the letter from James. He had arrived expecting to spend $5 on a forgotten box. Instead, he had been handed a piece of his life that he thought was gone forever. He closed the notebook carefully and rested his hand on the cover. "James wanted people to remember," he said quietly. "Not us, just the truth." Whitaker nodded. "Then perhaps it is finally time." Outside, the rain had stopped completely. Late afternoon sunlight pushed through the clouds and spilled across the auction hall windows. Dust drifted through the golden light. The room felt warmer somehow. Tyler slowly approached Walter. His face carried none of the arrogance from earlier. "Sir," he said awkwardly, "I owe you an apology." Walter looked at him for a moment and then smiled. You are not the first young man to judge a book by its cover. The crowd laughed softly. Tyler managed a nervous smile. The old veteran picked up the footlocker and closed the lid. The sound echoed gently through the hall. A forgotten relic. A hidden letter. A promise kept across 50 years. And all because nobody else wanted a $5 box. As the sunlight filled the room, General Whitaker glanced at Walter Hayes and quietly said the words that would stay with everyone there for the rest of their lives. Some men spend their lives chasing recognition. The rare ones earn it without ever asking for it.